Thank you. Thanks, Kim. And thank you and the rest of the folks at the Sustainability Institute. It is always a pleasure and a highlight of my professional and personal time and experiences each year to be a part of this when I can. It's my pleasure to introduce two fellows, Miriam Israel and Joe Field. Miriam is a dual degree graduate student at the Fletcher School at Tufts, where she's studying environmental policy and human security. She's also pursuing a master's degree at the Harvard Divinity School, a master's in theological studies. Joe Field is an environmental studies PhD student at the University of New Hampshire with a background in science communication and environmental policy. Her current research is focused on public participation in environmental policy processes concerning climate adaptation. In July, we joined together, the three of us, to paddle in kayaks and canoe on the Squamscott River and its entrance to Great Bay. And for me, it was wonderful for me to learn what they knew about the natural world around us. That was personally inspiring for me, because we're always in front of screens and we're always doing our work. It was terrific to get that sense from that day. Both Joe and Miriam brought a pro-social sensibility to the project that you're about to hear about. And they're leaning in to the social and societal aspects of climate action, I think resulted in a wonderful synthesis of the progress New England states are making or not making. And not by simply checking the boxes for clean energy policies and laws and attending climate action plans, but by digging in to find examples and evidence of leadership and innovation. So I'm going to hand it over to the fellows, and thank you very much.
Roger, and just to echo the sentiment, I think our paddling trip was definitely a highlight for us also, and it was great to hear from you and your background with birding, all of the wonderful wildlife, which I certainly am still getting.
I don't know if it's just me, but you sound pretty far away.
Oh, bear with me just a second. Is that better?
Much better.
Okay, great. So I guess just a quick overview of our project for the summer. The aim of our project was to assess essentially the levels of climate resilience which the New England states are developing and how that compares with the level of climate resilience that they will need to have in order to adequately cope with the impacts of climate change. So to do this, we used a framework which was developed by the Union of Concerned Scientists called the Resilience Gap Framework. And we applied this to reviewing state climate action plans, other climate policies, legislation, programs that are all kind of addressing climate change either through mitigation or through adaptation strategies. So the framework consists of 15 different principles for decision makers to use to kind of prioritize their investments in climate action that are not only scientifically sound, but also socially just, that make sense from a fiscal perspective, and are also ambitious enough to allow communities to become resilient to climate change. So our project is twofold, really. We're both testing the framework's ability to identify resilience gaps in a real-world scenario, but we're also assessing what each of the New England states are doing. So in order to do this, we conducted a combination of interviews and some desk research. And the purpose of the desk research was really to identify actually what exists on paper. So that includes climate action plans, policies, legislation, et cetera. And the interviews was, the purpose there was really to kind of understand how what's on paper is translating into action and how those are being implemented. So we then used the data that we gathered from both of these, and we applied these to the 15 frameworks of 15 principles of the framework to assess each state individually in a state-by-state analysis. Next slide, please.
All right, so first of all, thank you so much, Roger, for your support this summer. We really could not have done it without you and all of your connections that seem unlimited. And also thank you to Joe for being an amazing partner in this research. So I know that this is a lot to take in on this slide. What you're looking at is a stoplight chart that ranks all of the 6 New England states based on how well they align in their climate action plan, and the other column, which is everything else, so policies, legislation, programs, other research that's being done at the state level, how well all of the states align in those 2 categories with the framework principles. So you can look on the left and see the framework principles listed out. We've categorized them into 3 different groups: policy lifecycle, long-term planning and policy revision, and then equity and community needs. And so this allowed us to sort of see some higher level themes throughout the states and see whether there were trends in terms of topic and how well states were performing, both on paper and in theory and implementation. So what we found, and what you can probably see, is that there's a wide variety between state climate action plans on paper and in terms of implementation. Some are prioritizing only climate mitigation, others are considering mitigation and adaptation needs, but there really is a big range in terms of how well thought out these plans are, how well implemented they're being, and just sort of what they're including along in terms of mitigation and adaptation. One of the big challenges that, or one of the big themes that we found, is that the implementation is also very varied, particularly when it comes to funding. A lot of the funds that are happening at the state level are being channeled through municipalities. So they're not necessarily top-down funds. Municipalities really have to work to get that funding. I think we've seen that already in the presentations today. And this can result in a lot of disparities in who is able to access funding, since municipalities that are lower income are less likely to have the funds, or less likely to have the resources like planners or staff to mobilize or apply for funds. So just to give you an example of how this framework works and how we're understanding it, if you look at weed out existing maladaptation, which is in the policy lifecycle section, this is a principle where there are gaps across the board. You can see that none of the states have fully considered the issue of maladaptation. They're either in the yellow or sometimes in the red category, meaning that maybe it's coming up or it's really just not being considered at all. This is especially important today, now that we have IRA fund or Inflation Reduction Act funding, we have other infrastructure funding coming from the federal level, and we're probably going to see adaptation projects rapidly increasing and coming online at the national and state level. And so we want to encourage states and policymakers and implementers to really think about the potential for adverse effects with these adaptation projects. This is also an equity issue, because if we're not thinking through the ways that these adaptation projects are going to really impact the people living in these areas, there's a lot of room for inequity. And just to sort of round out the picture here, if you look at the equity and community needs section, we can see that there's a lot of gaps there as well. There is a lot of really good language online in these climate action plans, but there are definitely gaps in terms of how they're being implemented. So we think that that's another area where states can definitely do better. There's some good intentions there, but I think that there's always room for improvement. Next slide.
So our next steps, once we've finished up our final report, we want to share that with the folks that we interviewed in each of the New England states for comments and feedback. We're going to incorporate that into a presentation which we'll be delivering to the UCS Science Network sometime later in the fall. Our aim really there is to kind of equip UCS with both information about the gaps that exist that we found through our research, but also just to provide our feedback on how the framework actually operates and share our recommendations there for any revisions. So in terms of recommendations that we have going forward, it's sort of twofold here, because we have some recommendations specifically for UCS, but also for in-state climate experts and advocates outside of the UCS network. Again, kind of using the gaps that we identify to identify potential priority areas for their future work, working in their states. And another kind of key recommendation that we have is looking to integrate climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. That was one key piece that really emerged from our interviews and from our desk research also, is that often efforts towards mitigation and adaptation are being siloed away from each other. And we think it's certainly important when we're thinking about resilience and the need to both reduce further impacts of climate change while also adapting and preparing for the ones that we inevitably will face. Both of them play extremely important roles for climate resilience. So it's important to think about how we can coordinate those efforts. And given that what's on paper doesn't always match what actions are being taken in state, implementation really needs to be regularly monitored and assessed. So this project has been really great. It's been a wonderful learning experience, I think, for both of us. And I think exploring what's happening at a state level across the New England region has been really interesting when we think about the fact that currently and historically, we haven't had very strong federal leadership when it comes to climate change at all, really. So through this project, we found some great examples of what can be achieved and what work there still needs to be done at the state level. And it's certainly imperative that we continue looking at the state level and exploring the roles that state leadership plays when it comes to climate change. And lastly, we'd like to thank our mentor, Roger Stevenson, and everyone else at UCS who has helped us and guided us throughout this project. We certainly wouldn't have achieved as much as we have this summer without your help. And of course, we'd love to thank everyone at the Sustainability Institute at UNH, our advisory group, both our advisors and our peers as well.